This week in Idaho, Idaho's firefighters answer California's urgent call for help, specifically with the fires that are burning over there, if you haven't heard about that. The 2025 legislative session kicks off with Little's State of the State address, which we will be definitely diving into. And one of the things talked about in that speech was school choice, which is heating up this session. And the courts also uphold Idaho's ban on public funds for gender transitions. This is the Yokel Idaho Midweek Report, where we give you a quick overview of the news in Idaho for the last week. Hey, glad to have you here with us. We have a very packed midweek report this week. I wanted them to have all the details that they needed. The first one that has been going all over Twitter and the news and everything, the California fires. In response to them, the Sand Hollow Fire Protection District in Idaho is mobilizing to assist. Firefighters received an early morning text on Wednesday the 8th. Drake Fullerton and Caden Gilmore, two Sand Hollow firefighters, spent the day packing their bags and readying their equipment. The crews faced a 15-hour journey to California, because airports and all that and everything, where they journeyed to fight against the Palisades fire and other blazes, which have already claimed lives and destroyed over 1,000 structures as of the recording of this. I have no doubt by the time you listen, those numbers will have gotten larger, sadly. This deployment is part of a larger coordinated effort. For those of you that don't know, the National Interagency Fire Center is here in Boise and is managing the resources from across the West to help with those fires. Despite challenging conditions and the possibility of winds picking up next week, which would be the week this comes out, these brave Idaho firefighters are committed to standing shoulder to shoulder with their California counterparts in this firefighting effort. Moving on for the big headlines and stuff, and coming back here to Idaho, specifically for the legislative session, Governor Brad Little's 7th State of the State address kicked off this year's legislative session on the 6th. It was a preview of what is to come for this session and for Idaho's future, highlighting significant policy shifts and continued conservative governance, especially after more conservative seats have been picked up in Idaho. There were many points that the governor brought up in his speech, but the biggest one, and the one that's been getting the most conversation, is education. Governor Little endorsed state funding for private education, marking his first public support for school choice beyond traditional public schools. While this $50 million proposal signals progress, it has sparked debate within conservative circles. Some homeschooling advocates express concern that the requirements for, quote, fair, responsible, transparent, and accountable, end quote, could lead to unwanted state oversight of homeschooling curricula, which I know is something that Homeschool Idaho has been concerned about in the past with legislation like this. The proposal also includes about $150 million for public schools. If you couldn't tell, Little likes to spend money, maintaining Idaho's constitutional commitment to public education. There again, in our Constitution, we have to fund public education, so fulfilling that there. But on the topic of money and Little spending it, he may actually be going down the fiscally responsible route. Governor Little aligned with House leadership, proposing an additional $1 million in tax relief, building upon a $4.6 billion in previous tax reductions. This includes enhanced grocery tax rebates and income tax cuts. More on the grocery tax stuff later on. That is something that has also been brewing a lot if you've kept up with Idaho politics, showing a commitment to returning excess funds to Idaho taxpayers rather than expanding government programs, which is encouraging here. It's a step in the right direction. But on spending money, we would all argue it's probably a good thing. A significant $30 million allocation for water infrastructure and Little's infrastructure plans, alongside commitments to road and bridge improvements without tax increases. These investments reflect a growing need for our expanding state population, which we are all very aware of. However, this is where that kind of however comes in. Fiscal conservatives have raised concerns about increased federal funding dependency to achieve these goals without new taxes. There are one or two other additional highlights. Governor Little also addressed child welfare with a $9.6 million investment in foster care system improvements. He also celebrated the Boise State women's volleyball team's stance on forfeiting a match against a team with transgender athletes, protecting women's sports, which got a standing applause from lawmakers, which is very encouraging to hear. These initiatives reflect a balanced approach overall of governance while maintaining Idaho's traditional values and independence. Now, with all that said, we will have to wait and see how many of these actually make it through the legislature, who ultimately decides what gets passed and what doesn't. But this comprehensive agenda does set a course for Idaho's future. We can debate on if it's the right one, attempting to balance growth with conservative principles and biblical values of stewardship and community care. And continuing on that thread and specifically focusing on the school choice part of it, Idaho's 2025 legislative session has started with a bang for school choice, with Governor Brad Little, as we've talked about, proposing that $50 million allocation for school choice in his State of the State address. The debate centers on Rep. Wendy Horman's tax credit bill, offering families $5,000 per student not enrolled in public schools. So that also applies to private schools, with $7,500 for special needs students, so a little extra carve out there. The program prioritizes low-income families and maintains the $50 million cap aligned with Little's proposal. There is a divide that exists between conservatives and moderates on this issue. The Idaho Freedom Foundation opposes imposing public school-style requirements on alternative education options, arguing that parent choice provides sufficient accountability. Meanwhile, the state superintendent Debbie Crutchfield and Governor Little insist on strict oversight measures, or at least some accountability in the program. We'll see how it ends up coming out of committee. But to recap all that, Little's commitment to public education remains strong, proposing an additional $150 million for public schools. You don't need to worry, all public schoolers out there. There still is money going that direction. Specifically, a lot of that's going to be orientated towards rural facilities, mental health, and school safety. Crutchfield, for her part, also supports this dual approach while advocating for a weighted funding formula to help districts with high-cost students. As Idaho navigates this educational crossroads, especially divide in our political party, the collaboration between Governor Little and Speaker Moyle suggests potential for meaningful reform, if it isn't just exactly what we want, at least some movement, despite ongoing debates about accountability and oversight in the state's approach to educational choice. And keeping with the Idaho legislature, but the legislature of last year, federal judge Raymond E. Patrico denied a request for a preliminary injunction to block Idaho's new law banning public funds from covering transgender procedures or gender-affirming health care. Specifically about the law, which took effect on July of last year, I can say that now, prohibits Idaho Medicaid and public funds from covering gender-affirming medications and surgeries. Judge Patrico cited the plaintiff's legal strategy as a key reason for rejecting the injunction, noting their decision to let a temporary restraining order expire in July. The judge stated that the delay in seeking a preliminary injunction, combined with the health agency's notice of tampered gender care coverage, cast doubt on the plaintiffs suffering, quote, extreme or very serious damage without injunctive relief. After this victory for Idaho's ban on transgender procedures, the attorneys representing the suing transgender patients plans to proceed on the merits and seek a final judgment and injunction. If you enjoyed the Midweek Report, do us a favor and hit the like and subscribe button on YouTube, Rumble, or Twitter. It helps us reach more folks who love Idaho just like you. And continuing with the legislature here in Boise, yes, there's going to be a lot of stories on that since it kicked off. Idaho's legislature has reignited the debate on same-sex marriage, something that I would argue has always been going on, with Representative Heather Scott proposing a joint memorial to challenge the 2015 Supreme Court decision that legalized it nationwide. State Affairs Committee unanimously voted to introduce the bill, paving the way for a full hearing. Committees, they have a way of stopping things from getting to the floor. Scott argues that marriage laws are a state's right, claiming the Bergerfeld versus Hodge ruling, which, quote, undermines state sovereignty, end quote. The memorial calls the court's decision, quote, an illegitimate overreach, and seeks to, quote, restore the natural definition of marriage, end quote. This comes in part because Idaho in 2014 made same-sex marriage legal, not by the legislature, but because of the federal court's ruling. The proposal has drawn criticism from Democrat leaders who call it, quote, a sad distraction, end quote, from more pressing issues that should be dealt with in the legislature. And continuing with the theme of marriage, and one of the things that's needed in marriage, which is women, the Protection of Women and Girls in Sports Act, introduced by Senator Jim Risch, Mike Crapo, and Tommy Tuberville in the U.S. Senate, aims to bar transgender athletes from participating in women's sports or any other sport other than their actual gender, which is encouraging to hear. Granted, it may get stalled because, like most things in Congress, they have a happening of doing that, or in the Senate even. But for what the bill says, it proposes redefining gender based on reproductive biology at birth and prohibits federally funded schools from allowing males to compete in women's sports categories. Supporters argue, as they should, that this protects fairness for women athletes, with Senator Risch stating, quote, "Allowing biological males in women's sports is unfair to young women who compete tirelessly at every level." The legislation responds to an ongoing debates and the recent Biden administration's attempts to change the status quo regarding transgender participation in athletes, and specifically also probably the BSU volleyball thing that happened. While critics argue this bill unfairly discriminates against transgender athletes, proponents emphasize it will preserve competitive equality and Title IX protections. The bill has sparked some good discussion about gender identity, inclusion, and the future of women's sports in the US, which is sadly something we need to talk about a lot lately. And another thing on the financial side for the 2025 Idaho legislature is the attempt to repeal Medicaid expansion following a failed effort last year. Representative Jordan Redmond, a Republican from Coeur d'Alene, plans to reintroduce a bill proposing, quote, sideboards, end quote, like work requirements. The push comes after Republicans secured control of the federal offices and strengthened their supermajority here in Idaho. Very encouraging to see. As for supporters of this initiative, they argue that Medicaid's rising budget strains state finances, with costs far exceeding initial projections. They argue the program fosters government dependency and erodes local support from those like churches or other nonprofits. However, expansion proponents claim it has had a life-saving impact and broad public support. Nearly 61% of voters approved it in 2018 through the initiative process, with backing increasing since then. Opponents argue it provides crucial coverage for working Idahoans in jobs without health benefits. As the 2025 session marches forward here, lawmakers do face a difficult balance between fiscal concerns and constituents' healthcare needs. The debate promises to be heated. Like anything with money, it's not a comfortable or easy or fun thing, with both sides mobilizing supporters to influence the outcome, which I think that's every single issue that we do, but oh well. And speaking of something from the past that's coming back to haunt us, recent legislation, specifically the Idaho Public Library's House Bill 710, continues to face scrutiny over controversial content access to minors. The Clean Books for Kids, led by Mariana Cochran, has been documenting and challenging material that they deem inappropriate in children's libraries. The group's efforts have led to policy changes and new laws, but some libraries remain resistant to proactive measures, which is what the main intent of the legislation was to do, was to kind of nudge libraries in the direction that constituents are wanting. The Community Library Network has begun reviewing, thankfully, and relocating explicit materials, with 140 titles under legal review. However, as you can probably guess, in a more liberal part of the state, other libraries, like Coeur d'Alene's, have rejected requests to relocate controversial books, such as, and if you have children in the room, these titles aren't that bad, you might want to run them out, Sex is a Funny Word, which remains in the children's section, sadly. Clean Books for Kids continues its advocacy, hosting documentary screenings and encouraging communities to put pressure on libraries. The group aims to promote libraries to, quote, take initiative to clean out their own libraries, end quote, as the current pace of change is deemed too slow by many citizens here in Idaho. Which, if you didn't know about any of the stories we've talked about so far, and you know some friends or family that they would really love to know about it and you think it would help them, please don't hesitate to share this episode. Your shares help us spread the word about our beautiful state and help Idahoans stay connected and informed about what's going on. And speaking of Coeur d'Alene, Idaho Senator Ben Taze, a Republican from Coeur d'Alene, is set to introduce a bill that would significantly restrict diversity, equity, and inclusion, or DEI. Then there's the other one that's flipped around. You probably know if you've seen that in social media. Initiatives in Idaho's higher education institutions. Now, you might be saying, didn't the board already do that? Yes, the board did, but they're going further on the legislative part. This proposed legislation presented to the DEI task force, check out our past midweek reports to understand what's going on there, would prohibit DEI officers, diversity training, and mandatory DEI-related courses for students. The bill defines DEI as encompassing concepts like unconscious bias, so apparently I can have a bias in that sense, systematic oppression, and social justice. Under the proposed law, universities would be required to submit annual compliance reports to the Attorney General and education committees. The bill also includes a bit of an enforcement mechanism, which is always encouraging to see, allowing the Attorney General, Labrador, to seek civil penalties and enables students, staff, and alumni to sue institutions for violations. Critics are, however, pushing back, including Senate Majority Leader Melissa Winthrop, the Democrat representative in Boise, have raised concerns about the potential free speech implications and the inclusion of private causes of action. The DEI task force, which anything but pro-DEI, will be reviewing the draft before considering a recommendation before it hits the floor. Staying with DEI in education, but coming a little further down to high schools, Idaho is finding itself in a controversial situation with our high schools, where we've outsourced accreditation to Cognia, a global organization with deep-rooted ties to diversity, equity, and inclusion, or DEI principles. Specifically, the decision has raised concern among school administrators, I'm glad there's some of them that are concerned about this, who argued that Cognia's standards conflict with Idaho's constitutional mandate to maintain, with quote, the stability of a republic form of government, end quote. The outsourcing not only imposes significant costs on schools, but also introduces DEI-focused metrics that many argue are at odds with Idaho's values. This situation has continued to flame the debate about the state's control over educational standards and the potential influence of global organizations on local school systems, particularly here in Idaho. As Idaho schools work with recent legislation, which we've talked about, aimed at dismantling DEI in higher education and other forms of education, the continued use of Cognia for high school accreditation presents a bit of a paradox for educators and policymakers that needs to be addressed and probably will be this session. And then, here again, with the legislature, this is going to be a very heavy legislative episode. Idaho's legislature is set to receive a significant pay bump, as you may have heard that story earlier in the year, as the Citizens Committee recently approved a 19% raise for state lawmakers. The Citizens Committee on Legislative Compensation voted to increase the legislature's base salary from $19,913 to $25,000. with an additional $6,512 in per diem allowances. As for the decision, it came after the committee rejected a more substantial proposal from the State House leadership that would have increased compensation by 34%. That number was something that everyone was a little bit, hold on a second here. Meanwhile, a separate panel has recommended raises for all state employees. The Change in Employee Compensation Committee voted 7-3 to approve a $1.55 per hour increase for state workers. This raise will result in at least a 5% salary boost for employees earning about $64,480 or less annually. However, like most things, there's a however hiding there. Some committee members expressed concern about higher paid employees not keeping pace with the cost of living. The committee also approved larger increases for specific groups, including up to 8% for Idaho State Police troopers and 4.5% for IT and engineering staff. These recommendations will be presented by the Joint Finance Appropriation Committee, or JFAC, the committee that ends up deciding if the money gets spent or not, for final budget decisions, and then it heads to the legislature. Now, we definitely drank from a little bit of a fire hose there with the amount of stories about the Idaho legislature, so let's go a little further to the east there over to eastern Idaho. Perpetua Resources has received federal approval to proceed with the Stibnite Gold project in eastern Valley County, Idaho. The U.S. Forest Service issued a final record of decision after an 8-year review process. You wonder why it's so hard to do mining here in the U.S., marking a significant milestone for the company. Specifically, looking at what the project entails, it aims to create one of the largest gold, silver, and antimony mines in the United States, with an estimated 4.8 million ounce gold reserves and 148 million pound antimony reserve. CEO John Cherry expressed enthusiasm, stating that the approval elevates the project to a, quote, elite class, end quote, that has cleared the National Environmental Policy Act process. There's your culprit. The mine is expected to provide a substantial economic benefits, including over $1 billion in investment and an average of about 550 jobs during operations. As you can obviously guess, though it has gotten through all this gauntlet, there are some environmental objections. The Nez Perce tribe has objected, claiming the decision violates their treaty rights and threatens fish habitat. Environmental groups, for their part, have raised concerns about the potential impact on water quality and wildlife, which you would think if it went through an 8-year gauntlet, it wouldn't have to worry about that, but we live in America and the 21st century. Sadly, Perpetua still needs to secure additional permits and approval before construction can even begin, including those from the EPA and the Idaho Department of Environmental Quality. Here's hoping they'll be able to wade through all the red tape and it'll actually get through. But with all that said, let's celebrate. It did get this far and it did get through the federal process. And as we come to the end of the midweek report on last 4 here, and staying over there in eastern Idaho, in the rural landscape there, an encouraging project is set to improve a treacherous stretch of U.S. Highway 30. The Idaho Transportation Department has secured $20.8 million to construct 3 wildlife overpasses near Montpelier, addressing a long-standing issue of wildlife vehicle collisions. The project is slated for 2026, so we'll have to wait 1 more year. It will focus on the Rocky Point, a notorious 4-mile section where up to 70 mule deer collisions occur annually. By building underpasses and installing 8-foot tall fencing along 6 miles of the road, the initiative aims to guide migrating deer safely beneath the highway, where they won't get run over, or vice versa, humans won't hit them and hurt themselves or the deer. The effort also not only prioritizes driver safety, but also hopes to preserve crucial migration routes for the Bear Lake Plateau mule deer herd. Man, that's a big long one. Project impact extends beyond Idaho, benefiting neighboring Wyoming and Utah, and supporting the region's hunting and wildlife tourism economy. As for what the overall takeaway is from this, with 98% of the construction costs covered by a grant and additional funding from the U.S. Department of Agriculture for the fencing, this project is a significant step towards harmonizing human transportation needs, while still being good stewards of the wildlife in the area. And speaking of transportation, and a fun one, Amtrak's potential return to southern Idaho has sparked excitement and hope among residents and officials alike, me being one of those residents. Valley Regional Transit CEO Elena Clegg, recently appointed to Amtrak's board of directors, brings a fresh Pacific Northwest perspective to the table. Clegg, who will serve a 5-year term, aims to focus on expanding the national railway westward and strengthening relationships between states and non-passenger railways. For some context, the discontinued Pioneer Line, which connected Salt Lake City to Seattle via Boise until about 1997, might see a revival with this appointment. Clegg's appointment signals Amtrak's increased effort to broaden its railway networks westward and to have people from the West guiding that process. With support from Idaho's U.S. Senator Mike Crapo and Jim Risch, the possibility of restoring passenger rail service to the region is more likely than ever. Clegg emphasized the importance of providing transportation options to those of the West, where commercial air services are often limited and expensive. She plans to promote collaboration between states through programs like the Corridor Identification Program, which could lead to a study and developing a service model for rail in Idaho and other Northwest states as a whole. Now, please forgive me, we have to have one more legal story in here to get through. It was relevant, but I put it back down on the lower bit. Then we'll have a nice fun story to close this out here, so just bear with us here. In a encouraging turn of events, a $1.1 million defamation judgment against blogger Summer Bushnell in favor of drag performer Eric Posey has encountered some legal hurdles. Specifically, the 1st District Judge Ross Pittman ruled an exemption allowing Bushnell to protect certain assets from collection. While one of Bushnell's bank accounts remained subject to execution, her husband's account was deemed exempt. The court has also exempted a 2004 Subaru Forester, 2 pieces of jewelry valued about $1,000, and a handgun worth $1,500. Additionally, Bushnell can retain tools of trade up to $10,000 and personal property up to $7,500, with no single item exceeding about $1,000 in value. Judge Pittman granted Bushnell 1 week to select which personal items to exempt. The ruling has added complexity to the high-profile case, which stemmed from Bushnell's accusations against Posey during a 2022 Pride event. As the legal battle continues, the Churches and locals are watching it closely, with local officials among those present at the court proceedings. And with that dirty part off of our hands, on to some more fun stuff here in the Treasure Valley, particularly in Caldwell. Silverhawk Aviation, the largest flight school in Idaho and an internationally renowned one, is set to update the landscape of the Caldwell Executive Airport. Following the closure of the Caldwell Airport Cafe in February of 2023, the city has selected Silverhawk to build a new hangar and restaurant on this site. Brandon Sweeney, Silverhawk's chief operating officer, presented ambitious plans to the Caldwell City Council. The proposed two-story building will feature a restaurant, coffee shop, office space, and a pilot lounge. Man, now I just want to become a pilot so I can get in there. The design incorporates floor-to-ceiling windows for airfield viewing and may include repurposed aircraft parts as decor, paying homage to the original cafe. Beyond dining, Silverhawk envisions using the hangar space for aircraft leasing or potentially housing an aviation mechanics school. Sweeney highlighted the critical shortage of aviation mechanics, with Idaho currently having only one such school. I did not know about that. That's a little bit concerning there because it's weird. You can't just work on your aircraft. You actually have to be certified to do that. It's not like your car. The project has garnered support from council members who recognize the long-standing need to improve services at the airport. As Silverhawk prepares to take flight with this development, pun intended there, it hopes to bring a new but familiar flavor to Caldwell's aviation community. Which, speaking of taking flight, I will have to do that here, but thank you for listening to the entire report. I sincerely hope you found it enjoyable and valuable. If you liked the Midweek Report, make sure to check out our other content. Also, if we missed any important points or provided incorrect information, please feel free to reach out to us via email or sending me a tweet on Twitter at LocalYokelIdaho. With the small team we have, we're not able to cover everything, but we do our best to cover the most interesting and important stories. Thank you for your continued support and assistance. That's all for now, and I wish you a fantastic rest of your week. Godspeed.